All right.
Hello.
Yeah.
We are here, whether we want to be or not.
We are.
Yes, so I'm Cory Kerr.
And I'm Joshua Kemble.
And this is the Indie Review Show.
This is the series where we review the best of indie comics and other media like movies, TV, cartoons, books, and did we mention comics? The idea is that we're pulling back the curtains on our inspirations.
Josh and I have been professional illustrators, cartoonists, animators, graphic designers, and taught at the college level, and we're getting into the stuff that inspires us. So how you doing today, Josh?
Very excited. I'm actually really happy about the book we're going to be going over. So I am overcoming mad, crazy allergies because it's spring and I have bad genetics. And all to do this because I'm actually really stoked. I think it's a good pick this week, so pretty stoked about it.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too. And not only are we covering a comic book today, but this will be the first time on the Indie Review Show that we are also covering something that isn't a comic book. I'm going to give a little glimpse into the animation that they did. There was an attempt to turn this into a cartoon, and so they animated a pilot. And so I did a little cut together of some of the best clips from that pilot as well.
Oh, exciting!
Yeah, so that's fun. Yeah, so let's do. I can't remember what we call those.
Plugs.
That's it. I'm going to let the text do most of the talking today. Because, anyway, so plugs. Yeah, you can see my stuff at CoryKerr.com. And if you go to CoryKerr.com, that's CoryKerr. All my stuff is there. And if you're interested in watching some of the animated stuff that I've been doing, you can go to CoryKerr.com/animations, and they are all there. But specifically, I've been working on something that I'm kind of excited about with Wacom, which I'm doing some kind of behind the scenes stuff. So if you want to see some of those behind the scenes things, go check my stories on Instagram. Because there's kind of some fun stuff there. So I'll just leave that. But it's stuff I've never tried before, which is kind of cool. So
all sounds good. All right. Cool. Well, I'll be plugging as usual this book, Two Stories, which is a graphic memoir about faith and mental illness. It's basically a confessional graphic memoir that grapples with questions of faith, mental illness, depravity, and ultimately redemption in a fallen world. It's 122 pages, and it's available on Amazon right now. So if you just look for 2 stories by Joshua Kemble, that's where I'd prefer you buy it because it helps the book ranking and it helps the book sales increase and stuff like that. If you're into the kind of indie comics that we review on this show, I think this would be right up your alley. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, 122 handwritten pages, and you can get it there or basically any online retailer or your local comic book shop and ask them to order 2 stories. So with all that out of the way, now that we got the plugs out of the way, let's get back to what did you bring for us, Cory? That I'm excited about, you're excited about.
Yeah. So I brought to you today The Amazing Screw-On Head and Other Curious Objects. It's kind of like an anthology all made by one guy.
I love it.
I think that's kind of the best way to describe it. So the first story is The Amazing Screw-On Head, and then that just kind of ends, and and then they jump into a few other stories that are kind of related. So this is stuff that Mike Mignola has done that doesn't really belong in the Hellboy BPRD universe. So it's like stuff that is other than that, which is kind of cool. I think it could probably fit into that because it's all during like the Civil War and stuff. But anyway, before we jump into that, I put together a little cut of the cartoon, and so just to kind of see like what they do, and because the reason, well, I'll get into this. So this show is about our inspirations, right? So this is the show where we talk about stuff that's inspired us, and one of the things that was really inspiring me to get into animation was actually that this pilot was on the behind the scenes DVD of Hellboy 2, The Golden Army.
Oh, nice.
And along with some UPA stuff like the Telltale Heart and stuff like that. I don't know why, but there's just like a handful of really cool cartoons on there. And so I actually found this really obscure pilot on this behind the scenes of this random DVD before I came across the comic. The comic like has won Eisners and all kinds of stuff. So Mignola had a good year in 2003. I think he won at least 2 Eisners that year, if not more. And several of them are in this book. So without further ado, here's the cartoon, and then I'll kind of talk about what I liked about that.
These are the adventures of the amazing Screw-On Head. Screw-On Head. Calling Screw-On Head.
Coming, Mr. President. Yes, sir.
Tell me what you know about the Kazakhstan fragment.
Scrawled on unshaven goat skin, it supposedly details the life of Gung the Magnificent.
What is the meaning of this?
I thought I was clear. You know something I don't know.
I'll tell you everything.
I'm so excited, I just made water in my pantaloons. There it is. Gung Agroesh, the left eye of Nog, the jewel worshipped by the wizards of Mu and the black priests of Atlantis, finally passed down to Gung the Magnificent, who was chosen by the gods to conquer the world with it. And now, it's my... Ew. It's not a jewel, it's a dirty old piece of crap.
It's a turnip, and it looks like it has a small parallel universe inside.
I can't allow that.
Bah! You are an irritant to me.
So you kind of see like the humor is just amazing.
Yeah.
And the animation is really subtle, but also like is just incredible. And I think having there's some stuff that I think the cartoon improved upon in the comic. And my favorite thing is just having like Abraham Lincoln have a video call during the Civil War, which is basically just like a triangle where his mouth is open or closed, and the triangle just rotates as he talks. So anyway, and then just stuff like, you know, a monkey with a a machine gun that he's firing off, and I don't know. There's just
a
so
universe
much
inside of a turnip, like
right,
yeah. It's so great.
So anyway, yeah. So, yeah, basic rundown of this. Mike Mignola basically did everything except colors and letters. And so you've got Clem Robbins and Pat Brosseau on lettering. You've got Dave Stewart on colors.
Can I pause for a second and just say, like, one of my favorite things about Mignola is Dave Stewart. I think for people, especially first learning flat colors, like, look to Dave Stewart. Like, the guy is like literally one of the best colorists around.
Oh yeah, he is phenomenal. And if you're not specifically looking for the colors, you don't really notice them because he does such a good job. It's almost like, really good typography kind of is invisible. Yeah, I completely agree, because I mean, Mignola's style is bizarre. It's kind of a weird style, but it works so well, with kind of this muted color palette. And there's still you still have all that contrast and everything. But yeah, he does a really good job.
That's so exciting.
So yeah, he wrote one of these stories with his daughter. And the story behind that is kind of cool. But The Amazing Screw-On Head is dedicated to Abraham Lincoln. And the idea is that Mignola here, he had this idea for a toy. He thought it would be really cool if you had this head that you could screw into different robot bodies. And then in the back matter, he says, but I don't know how to make toys. I know how to make comics. So I wrote a comic instead, which I think is a great reason to do a comic. But so we start off, and Abraham Lincoln, we've got all these shots. It's kind of a very Eastern style of comics here, where we're setting the scene more than like telling literally what's going on in the story.
Yeah.
And I love that these little moments that kind of just give us an idea of where we are and what we're doing.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah. And so this is our first introduction to Screw-On Head, as he's getting an 18th century video call from Abraham Lincoln. And you see like robots with the number 27 in them, and you see like all of this kind of old steampunk, diesel punk style machinery and robotic stuff. And to introduce the characters, we've got Abraham Lincoln. You've got this amazing Screw-On Head, who everybody calls Mr. Head, and then his manservant, who is called Mr. Groin. And they have this conversation that basically starts out and just says, one of your former manservants, who was also a professor of ancient languages, and has since been reanimated as Emperor Zombie, has stolen an untranslatable manuscript. And I love the joke here. Mr. Groin is saying, but it's untranslatable. And Screw-On Head says, it's untranslatable so far. You forget that Emperor Zombie was Professor H.G. Manifold, the master of ancient languages. It is as you say that really intelligent people should be cremated. And like, it cuts to this shot where he's like framed by like a bald eagle with a shield and everything. And he says, for the sake of national security. So then they used a stuffed dog to locate where Emperor Zombie is. And Emperor Zombie is always surrounded by flies. Even when those flies aren't near him, they like follow his balloon.
Oh, I love it.
And the sound effects, there's two sound effects that are used often in this comic. One is whir, which is like when his head is being screwed on. And another one is poof. There are several characters that turn into other things. Like there's a woman who's a vampire that turns into a bat. There's a guy who is transformed into this giant ancient demigod, demon looking thing. And each time that happens, it's like poof. So we have whir, kung, anyway, and then you've got like the propeller sound, like grung, 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 grung.
I just absolutely love Mignola's ability to give like the minimal detail possible,
Yeah.
and yet like also just have such a distinctive style. Like I've never mistaken any other artist as Mignola.
Right.
Like it's just such a unique. It's definitely very influenced by Miller, but
Mhm.
it's a lot more cartooned. Like it's a little. It's weird. It's like more representational than Miller, but at the same time also like more cartoony in the sense of like each character has like very unique shape and silhouette, which is something I'm noticing about books you pick, which I think is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
So far. That's cool.
And you can seamlessly go from, a character like Mr. Head here,
Yeah.
and this rather detailed portrait of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And it feels like it belongs in the same book because even though there's more detail and more line work here, there's still a very good attention to light and shadow, and that's kind of his signature style. Like the planes of the face and the planes of the other shapes that he's doing, those cylinders in the background and the brick wall, in the shadow and the staircase. It's such an incredible, most people who are kind of amateurs might mistake this for a simple style.
Yeah.
And in reality, what's happening is this is a master of form. This is somebody who really understands three-dimensional objects and how they would play. It's fascinating how he does that.
Yeah, it's incredible. And the weird thing is, if you ever see videos of him working too, he works pretty incredibly quickly as well. And so it's like the command he has, you're right, over form is just it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and I wanted to point out, we talked about the colorist here. I wanted to point out that there's some very subtle gradients. And in my opinion, that's the only way people should use gradients.
Me too.
Unless you're intentionally trying to do something horrific looking, which is, sometimes what you want to do. But when you look down here, there is an ever so slight kind of bluish purple radial burst right here, because this is not a focal point. And so he's pulling it into the black with that. And then it gets lighter as we get down to this figure. Mm-hmm. And this is where Mignola and Stewart kind of shine together. He has black pants, and that's where the brightest part of that gradient shows up. And so we have the highest value contrast on this character here, both in value and in hue.
Mm-hmm.
And it just works really well there. Another example of that is there's an ever so slight gradient as we fade off into the distance. It's brighter over here as it gets closer into the foreground, and then as it goes up this direction. And I bet that gradient is, maybe 5 to 7 points difference.
Yep.
It's very, very subtle. So anyway, so they the other thing that I love about this whole world is that Mignola doesn't spend any time explaining anything.
Yeah.
We just accept the fact that for some reason Mr. Groin is able to pilot this bullet-looking rocket, and that there's some sort of technology that existed back then that they just shoot it out of this cylinder, and then he can steer it. And then and there's no like, it's just like back to Earth, please, Mr. Groin. There's no like, well, thank you for loading up the the steam powered whatever. That they just don't bother explaining like how this person is a robot. Or it's just like it is what it is, and the world building is in between the panels, in that there's no explanation of who these people are, or why they are here, or how they are here. They just are.
Yeah.
And I love that.
That's so great.
So then we're introduced to Emperor Zombie, who is right here, Dr. Snap, and a madame who turns into a bat occasionally and is probably a vampire.
I love the Edward Gorey-esque interest in sort of the gothic and the macabre, but with this like B movie twist that he always does too. It's just, I don't know, it's such a unique palette and voice. It's just great.
And I love
those names.
Right.
Like Emperor Zombie is a fantastic name for a villain. you know.
The interesting thing about this is he wrote one of these stories with his daughter. It's one we'll go over a little bit later. And I love the childlike simplicity of some of the names, like Emperor Zombie. That would be exactly the name that some kid would come up with, or Hellboy, or Lobster Johnson. I mean, they're just ridiculous in their childlike nature. It's so awesome.
That's so great.
So anyway, so they are hunting. They're hunting this thing. They've translated the scroll, and then just like these are just background elements. Like we just see this guy standing here. This is this figure here who is Gung, and Gung apparently was chosen to take over the world centuries ago, and failed for some reason. We don't really know anything about him other than that. And he's flanked by some very Greek, Egyptian, and Roman kind of elements that are kind of all mixed in. There's even some Mesopotamian kind of architecture and stuff. It's just Mignola saying, "Look, old ancient things that are creepy and cool." And there's kind of just all that going on. So Emperor Zombie and his crew go up, and we see. I love the letterer here puts that in kind of a blood red. Foolish mortals, beware my, and then Emperor Zombie just shoots him and says, "Quiet, you horrible thing." And that bounces to the ground. He goes on this big thing about Atlantis and the wizards and all that stuff. And we kind of saw that in the cartoon. And then he pulls out this turnip. And I feel like the cartoon kind of missed that because the pose of his hand like barely touching that turnip is just so good because he's just so grossed out with it. He was expecting this giant jewel, and it's just this old rotting piece of vegetable. And that's the joke that was in the cartoon. It's not a jewel; it's a dirty old piece of crap.
I also just again those flies that follow him everywhere. That's hilarious.
Yeah, in every panel that he's in, he is a rotting zombie. And then anyway, in the comic, this is where the comic and the cartoon differ a little bit. Dr. Snap is the one or Professor Snap is the one who detects that there's a parallel universe inside. We've got the stuffed dog, and we've got Screw on Head and Mr. Groin hurtling through the air in this bullet. They crash land, and as they're crashing land, this is some more like the subtlety of this is where the humor comes in really powerfully. Is you've got like big booms, and you've got this giant, like almost World War I style machine gun, Gatling gun turret deal, run by these zombie skeletons. And when he exits the rocket or whatever you would call that, the sound effect is poot. Like it's just like, doop. You just kind of like, there's all of this giant stuff happening, and then boop.
Oh, I love it. I also love the simplicity of Mignola when it comes to a panel like that, where it's like once again, not simple, like easy,
right?
But just like even that little kind of stick figure sketch to signify the character, and yet it's just the right amount of detail. Yeah. And that's the thing I like about Mignola. He never he seems to just have this perfect balance where he never over labors or under labors anything. Right. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is really good. So then there's a battle with these kind of Civil War style, zombie creatures that work for Emperor Zombie. We go through and we have Professor Snap about to establish contact by what looks like just plugging in a pair of headphones into the turnip. It's just like a little headphone jack there, little 1/4 inch. And we have Poke, Oops, Zap, and he turns into this giant demigod frog creature. And he says, "Free at last from my vegetable prison." And here's these kind of side-by-side panels where she turns into a bat and just poof. And you'll like this, Josh, because this is
costuming too. Sorry, it's just so great.
Yeah. He inked both of these, even though they're very similar. You can tell that there are differences between the two. It's not just a copied
Yeah.
computer copy panel. It's hand inked.
Yeah, I do think you can't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure Mignola is one of those guys who's old school in the sense of like redrawing everything.
I think so
yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least in the times that I've encountered a repeatable panel,
Yeah.
I've noticed differences. So I'll kind of skip past. I don't want to give away the end of the story, and I want to get to some of the other stories. But some good action sequences. They escape in their kind of death skull helicopter thing. There's kind of a fight between the two, and then just one of my favorite things is we just have some woman cradling Screw-On Head's head, calling him a hero, and then I'm going to read these. At this juncture, we had hoped to present the secret origin of Screw-On Head, but as it turns out, the darn thing's a secret. So instead, we present 3 horrible old women and a monkey. Cheers!
Ah.
And then the next few pages are a werewolf, a cannibal, a criminal lunatic, and a monkey.
So, I mean, wow. The other thing I was going to say, just to for anybody like watching this or whatever, it's like the thing I was saying about Dave Stewart's color too is how subtly and beautifully that palette went all over the place.
Oh yeah.
And yet it's with simple 2 or 3 tone color.
Yeah.
And even at certain points, toward the end where he just goes straight to black and white. The thing I always liked about Dave Stewart's colors is if you had a colorist who was over rendering, you would miss so much beauty in Mignola's line work. And it's it's just that subtlety and that variance in his color choices that just it's actually really hard to work in muted tones like that.
The restraint that it takes is incredible. I've tried to do it at times, and it is very difficult.
I love it.
So, there's a few more stories here, and so here's part 2, the other curious objects, and I like that it's the amazing Screw-On Head and other curious objects, and part 1 is just one story of Screw-On Head.
Yeah.
And part 2 is and here's a bunch of other stuff that I just wanted to do.
Yeah.
And they're not really related. So Abu Gung and the Beanstalk is this story as translated by Professor E.E. Stoop. And so this guy who's Professor E.E. Stoop, and one of the things that I love about a lot of Mignola's characters in this book is they all have these very ornate walking stick staff situations. And as you go through, they're very different, but this is the winged disc of Osiris, which is on the lintel, the cross piece of every doorway of any Egyptian temple after Abraham visited it in the Old Testament, in case anybody's wondering. That's not in the book. I just threw that in for free. But that's always a really interesting thing to see. And you've got goats' heads and all this stuff. And so anyway, there's this kid, and he sees this giant vine. And this kid was cursed with an eventful life. And he comes upon this woman and asks for a potato. And she basically says, we don't have any potatoes, but we only eat broken furniture and cobwebs, but what little we have, we are welcome to share with you. And so he's told this story about how their dad died and they squandered all of his money on jewelry and then ended up selling the jewelry for food. And then their third sister, instead of selling the jewelry for food, traded it for this beggar who is this character that is obviously not a normal homeless person, for magic beans. And so they beat her, and because she was stupid, and she ended up eating the magic beans herself instead of planting them, because this is a diversion from the story, right?
Yeah.
And so here's her corpse with the vine growing out of it. And even though he's quick and fast, it takes him 9 days to climb the vine. And at the top of the vine, he finds the devil, and he basically just says, "Look what's over there." And there's this whole conversation that they have, but we have this, I don't see anything. And anyway, he tells the devil, oh, she got what she deserved and everything. and he tells the devil, oh, well, she ate it and it grew out of her nose and she's not dead. And he's like, she's not dead? No, actually, she's planning to join the circus. And the devil's like, man, that is a nose that I would like to see. And so he leans over, and then Abu kicks him, punt, and he falls to his death. And when he hits, it's 500 times more of the jewels that they missed, and so that is the end. That's the end of that story. And then the bat grabs the boy. And he never returned.
Oh, I love it.
And that is the beginning of the magnificent Gung, who almost conquered the entire world. And so this is kind of a little bit of a backstory to the character who had the turnip with the parallel universe in the inside.
Okay, so I also just want to point out, like, the lore, and you're right about, like, the kind of, like, borrowing all this stuff that just seems ancient and old-timey for just the sake of kind of creating this sort of old professorial vibe. That kind of runs throughout all of his work and creates such a unique universe, you know. I love that so much about Mignola's work, because it's like, it just feels like an old bookstore,
right?
You know.
And I love the confidence that he has in his storytelling.
Yeah.
To be able to just completely invent something that never happened. Yeah. And then comment on it as if everybody already knows what's going on. Like, so, you know, Gung the Magnificent. This is his childhood. You know Gung. Everybody knows Gung the Magnificent. So anyway, I love the confidence that it takes. This story was written by he and his daughter Katie. So Katie had drawn a picture at school of a shape of a snake that was angry at a bunch of shapes. and so you can see the shapes here. And so as they were walking home from school, they came up with this story, and she told him he was angry at the shapes because the shapes had come to kill his friend. And so I imagine that if you're Mignola's daughter, that's the type of normal thought that you would have. Mm-hmm. And so you have this king who is also a monkey, and you have this magician, and he says, you see these shapes? And this is written, it's not Mignola's voice. It actually sounds like his daughter. I think he probably translated what she said as accurately as he could. And then maybe added a few things. So he makes the shapes disappear. Poof, they're gone. And the Monkey King is now shocked. Zounds, I stand corrected. You, sir, are the greatest magician in the world. And he says, I'm not. This is a great honor. Why are you so sad? The snake, his friend. And I love these notes, because these notes in the margins here, they kind of feel like the kid kind of like throwing in like, this is his snake, the magician's best friend. Like I've seen when you and Benji, your son, did stories, there were like little notes in the margins kind of like that. Like, this is why this exists all of a sudden.
Yeah, exactly. You know?
Yeah. And so anyway, the magician tells his friend the snake that he made those shapes disappear, but they will come back, and when they do, he will die. And so they do everything they can to live a great life together, and they fly kites, and they just have a wonderful life. And then they see that the shapes have returned, and this is the drawing, right? Is the snake angry at these shapes coming, and and the snake says, change me into a lion and I will bite them and I will swallow them, and then you will live forever. And then he says, I can't, but everything I own will be yours and you can remember me now. And the magician died, but he was happy in his passing because he was so well loved by the snake. The end, in a not beating heart. And then we just have this beautiful, I mean, this is just here because he wanted to draw it. It has nothing to do with the story other than like, here's the snake. Remember the snake from this previous story? This is just here because there's an empty page, and it's just so incredibly beautiful. I mean,
yeah, the composition.
And the leaf work and the details and the hint of stairs instead of going in and rendering in detail every stair in perspective, we've got the hint of the edge. Yeah, and there's so much of it that is just incredible.
Yeah, I love Mignola's compositions. Like, he can do a full page or a cover better than almost anyone, and it's partially because of choices like that, where it's like creating this kind of L shape
Right.
up in the top. Like it's not quite symmetrical.
Yeah.
But it's got this like beautiful kind of figure foreground flip going on with like the values, and it's just like that kind of balance, which you'll notice in like most of his panels. It's just it's astounding that someone that good can continue to just put out amazing work. Anyhow.
Yeah, so The Witch and Her Soul, and you'll see exactly what you're talking about, Josh, in all of these. What I love about his stuff is where the figure is white, the background is dark, and where the background is white, the figure is dark. There's a constant switching of those, but it's such a subtle way that you almost don't notice it. But we need to see her hair, and so there's a giant shadow behind her, and we need to see that she's got a shadow on her face, and so there's a lit piano behind her, and in every shot, you kind of have that situation. So he said of this one that he came up with it. Just it appeared to him as a whole story, including the name Manx and Henkel. And so Manx and Henkel are two homunculi here, and they hear a sound and they think it's death. That's their first assumption, is it must be death. And I love that this woman, the witch, is sitting here at a piano with Post-it notes on it, some sort of skeleton zombie king and a horseshoe. And then there's all of these little, there's a rubber duck right here. There's an alligator that is hanging from an eye hook from the ceiling. Like there's just an incredible amount of amazing things that you almost don't even notice because, again, Stuart comes in and gives us the highest point of value contrast here, which gives us a focal point.
That's so great. And just the curio shop vibe of everything Mignola does is just excellent,
Yeah.
Where it feels like you're walking into some strange ancient curio museum.
So I am afeared of death, and the woman dies, and in dying, her soul leaves her body and is changed to her as a bird into the woman's mouth. Death shows up through the chimney. And I love this, that the Henkel and Manx don't believe that it's the devil. They don't believe that it's the devil until he turns red. And so he comes down and he says, I'm the devil. And they're like, I don't think so. And then poof, he's red. And they're like, oh, okay. What do you want? So then, the devil explains, well, she wanted magic powers so she could do all kinds of horrible things. And I made a deal with her that her soul would be mine if I gave her magic powers. But I also made a deal, and I always throw this into my contracts, that I also get whatever horrible things she creates. And that would be you homunculi. And then, so it's off to hell. And they're like, well, we're made of wood. We're like, I don't know if they're homunculus or if they're puppets, but he lists them. Mannequins, puppets, or homunculi. So they're one of those or multiple of those. And he says, but we're wood, we'll burn in hell. And he's like, well, the deal's the deal. And then the devil reconsiders and says, I suppose I could turn you into evil puppets, but you'd have to promise to do something really evil before the end of time. And they say, we'll take it. And so he changes them. This is kind of a twist on the Pinocchio story. He changes them to evil puppets. So now they're red because that's evil. And the devil takes her, and he says, I don't expect much from those guys, but I've made evil puppets, and that's a good day's work for me.
I also just love how that, again, just, Mignola's simplicity, it's like a conscious simplicity, like the way he rendered those chains with it's just literally the shape.
Right.
It's so smart and just so well executed. It kills me.
Yeah. And then I think I think Amazing Screw on Head is my favorite character, but I think The Prisoner of Mars is my favorite story in this book.
I love it.
So The Prisoner of Mars is these four Victorian gentlemen sitting down at a table, casually discussing Professor Snap's trial and legal execution. Bad business, that. And they're like, and just names like Cosgrove. I love that, anyway. So they're sitting and they're discussing, and he has a poster that's the magician and the snake, just to call back to one of those other stories. Or I think this has got to be the sign. So they're in a pub called The Magician and the Snake. And so anyway, he's telling the story of how he was busy, and he got a frantic call from Professor Cyclops, who was just a normal person and not a Cyclops, and tells him, that meteor shower that was happening a little while ago? Well, one of them landed in my backyard, and I need you to come over here right away. And he says, I was otherwise engaged poking at something in a tank. He doesn't say what it was, but he's just poke with a stick. And so weeks passed, and he gets a call, and the guy is much more freaked out. And poor old Cyclops, had I meant to, so he kind of missed his opportunity. So he goes there, and he shows up, and I mean, I'm just gonna show everybody this. There's the house. And then there's the inside of the house, just full of what you would expect of the creepy grave robber style scientists that were around back then.
Yeah, some of them were artists too, weirdly enough.
Yeah.
There's a lot of tales of classical artists that used to do grave robbing so they could study anatomy.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, a naturalist back in the day was an artist by necessity because they didn't have photographs.
Exactly.
And it wasn't like anybody was like, wow, you can draw really well. It was like you're expected to draw really well because you're a naturalist. It was
exactly.
So anyway, so he goes through, he finds a diary. And he's reading the diary, and it mentions like curious feeling, the dream again, Mars, and then he writes Mars, and then he starts writing in different things. And then kind of Cyclops shows up and doesn't look too great, and stab. And then we cut from the stab panel to guilty. And I don't know how this works other than it's Mignola. It's just there's this skeleton king in the background of this British magistrate. And I just love the symbolism of this. So you've got the creepy guy muttering nothing. You've got the stab panel. You've got the magistrate with like the skeleton king with the scroll and the crown. And then you have that he was hanged. And then his ghost is leaving and says, "This will do nicely." So as his ghost is leaving his body, it decides to travel to Mars, as you do. And when it arrives at Mars, they see him coming, and they were prepared for him. And they trap him in a light bulb, and they give him a robot body because they didn't have any Martian corpses around that he could possess at the time. So he travels through Mars, wandering around, and he finds Professor Cyclops. And what has turned out is that the Martian who landed in Professor Cyclops' backyard, Professor Cyclops dissected it because it was a Martian, and then it took over his body, and his soul was transmitted to Mars, and they gave him a recent corpse, and so now he is giving lectures on the planet Earth as a Martian with a human soul. And Professor Snap is wandering around in a light bulb carried by a frying pan robot.
And I'm sorry, just like the way that Mignola like draws like a Martian is just so unique. Similarly, like, if you were to even describe this story to somebody other than Mignola, they probably wouldn't choose to draw this like kind of flying saucer headed light bulb of a character. It's just his character art and design choices are just so cool.
Yeah.
So great.
So yeah, I agree. And I mean, it looks like a Metroid. It looks like a jellyfish. It looks like an octopus. It looks like a crab. But it's also just none of those things. It kind of feels like it might be semi-transparent or translucent a little bit or something. Anyway, so they're having a discussion, and he's saying, "Oh yeah, I'm telling him all kinds of things about humans and about the Earth." And then he's like, "Do you think that you should?" And he's like, "Well, I'm a scientist, not a philosopher." And so they kind of wander into this. Notice the color change. They kind of wander into this giant globe of Earth where this is like a military tribunal, and it's obvious that they're going to go and do an invasion. And so, there's this big fight, and then just Cyclops runs over, hot wires something, and just blows up the entire civilization, killing all the Martians. Now everyone is dead, but it just so happens that my robot body fortunately turned out to be indestructible. And so he survives, and he drifts around this empty planet now that everyone is dead, and then he finds one of the original inhabitants, which is just these hops-styled plants. And they just say, hey, we hated those guys. Thanks for blowing them up. Is there anything we can do? And he's like, yeah, put me back on Earth. And so they create a new body just like his old body and transport him back to Earth. And so here's Snap and Cyclops' grave right outside of the pub where they're having this conversation.
And I love that it kind of ties back to hops to kind of bring you back to the pub.
Right, exactly. And what I love about this, many people our age might not appreciate this style of storytelling. And what I recommend is that you go to Relic Radio and listen to old school radio plays of science fiction where they're like 20 minutes long. This is this whole story of The Prisoner of Mars is a classic science fiction radio drama.
Yeah, it's totally
just
is.
like those. And I love them. And then they just have a chapel of curious objects. And he says in the back matter here that he just wanted to draw a bunch of evil puppets. And so he just has a chapel of curious objects. And he says, this isn't part of the story. It has nothing to do with anything, but I feel like it fits the book like a weird hat on an oddly shaped head. And so we just have some panels that I'll kind of zoom in here on of just some creepy evil puppets. And he said, I would have liked to have drawn more, but I felt like the reader might get bored of looking at creepy evil things. And I don't know what's going on here, except for we see this guy here, and it's the snake and the magician again with the pointy hat. There's a panel that can be taken out, and you take that panel out, and there's a skull sitting in there with the number 61, just like the Amazing Screw-On Head, and the light bulb, just like the Prisoner of Mars. And then here's the shapes that killed the magician, and here's the magician's heart. And
That's so good.
It has nothing to do with the story, but that's that.
That is so excellent.
I'll flip through a sketchbook real quick because it's always awesome. You see Snap, you see Gung, Abu Gung.
And even there, it shows a lot of the underlying structure. So, like, while his work may look simple, it's like intentional simplicity.
Yeah.
Because, like, he'll take a complicated underdrawing and just break it into those basic blacks and whites. That's so insane.
Yeah. So he also mentioned that he spent way more time drawing Martians and Martian machinery than he normally would, but he was really enjoying himself, so he just drew a lot of it. So I rarely spend this much time working out stuff in my sketchbook, but I was having way too much fun with these guys. So that is The Amazing Screw-On Head and Other Curious Objects, Part 1 and Part 2. And here are a bunch of evil puppets. There are just a few dozen of the puppets I designed. I was still having way too much fun. And in the Chapel of Curious Objects was originally going to be longer with more pages drifting through the chapel, looking at puppets. I was never going to get tired of drawing those puppets. But in the end, I was afraid the reader might get tired of looking at them. They say less is more. I'm not sure if that really applies to spooky old puppets.
Oh my goodness. Sweet. All right. Well, so should we get into balancing the books real quick?
Absolutely.
All right. So let me throw this up here for a second. And let me also, I think I have it here. Yes. Okay. So it's time to balance the books. The Indie Review Show is brought to you by Audible. You can get a free audiobook and support this show by going to audibletrial.com/IRS. And actually, this ties in so beautifully with The Amazing Screw-On Head because, there's a very like Python-esque humor, very Terry Gilliam vibe to most of Mike Mignola's work. And my recommendation for this book, for an Audible book to check out, which you can get for free using that Audible trial, is Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, a sort of biography by Eric Idle, who was one of the key members of Monty Python. So this book gets into, he's a founding member of Monty Python, a creator of Spamalot, the Broadway version of Monty Python's Holy Grail. And it's a really funny memoir that basically talks about all sorts of interesting things about him coming of age, and then how he met all of the original members of Monty Python, how he was, about his friendships with George Harrison, David Bowie, Robin Williams, and just kind of, Mick Jagger, Steve Martin, Paul Simon, Lorne Michaels. Like it gets into a lot of interesting biographical stuff about Eric Idle. But the great thing is it's written with the wit and brilliance that Eric Idle has always used. And so I'd recommend checking that out. Like I said, using IRS agency.com if you want to check out a better a link to it, but audibletrial.com/IRS will get you that free trial. And then also, if you like this book or any of the other books we're recommending, go to irisagency.com. In fact, it's a really easy way to support the show. And you can click one of the links before you purchase anything on Amazon, and we'll get a little kickback, and it doesn't raise the price for you. So yeah. Let me get back to my cam, and then there we go. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
This is what the whole time you were talking, it was like, gotta remember to unmute myself. Yeah. So you and I had both already read this comic.
Yeah.
So what are some of the so I'm not gonna ask if I've convinced you, but what are some of the things that you might that have inspired you or you might steal for some of your own work?
Mignola has always been really inspirational in the sense of just his choices and his simplification of form and his choices to do solid blacks. And he also has this tendency to kind of carve out his figures like with ink. So it's got this kind of very unique style to it, but like his control over areas of black and white, I actually like more than Frank Miller's. I don't think they would exist without Frank Miller, because I think Frank Miller kind of sort of took what Eisner was doing and then super simplified it. Right. And just started going solid black and solid white. And I think Mignola kind of took that and applied style and substance to it. And I like the way Mignola stylizes figures as well and pays more attention to anatomy. So I think there's just so much you can pull from Mignola's work. For me, Dave Stewart was like a massive influence on coloring for me. And he actually was one of the first colorists to talk about when you're coloring in CMYK, making sure there's a value of 5 difference between each color. So never go like 90, 20, 20, 20, be like 90, 25, 20, 30 or something like that. Like,
right.
I don't know what that would be off the top of my head, but point being like just getting in there and making sure it's a difference of 5s. And that's actually something that I, to this day, when I'm working in CMYK or flatting or coloring, I look to Dave Stewart a lot. Dave Stewart also worked on Simpsons as well. So it's interesting because it's like he can go all over the place as a colorist, but I definitely feel like that's a huge influence. But also story-wise, being that the pitch I'm working on right now is like has to do with like there's like a seance and kind of like creepy Victorian era. Yeah. Just the choices he makes, I think can be very informative to anyone. I would actually definitely see his influence on your work, especially the series you're building for potential comics in the future.
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear kind of your take on it too. But to me, it's like with Mignola, it's always ink, control of blacks,
Yeah.
and just awesome, great, just fun, unique Mignola-esque stories, you know?
Yeah, and for me, I mean, obviously composition and
Yeah.
value contrast are huge, defining the form, and not being so beholden to what is real, like perspective or whatever. If
Yeah.
you need a shadow there, put a shadow there, that type of thing. But really what stands out to me about this, I don't necessarily love all of Mignola's work. Some of it falls a little bit flat. He's incredible. He's a master, and so it's not to take anything away from him. But this particular collection of stories, I think, stands out in a couple things that I kind of already pointed out. But one of the things that I have a tendency to do is I overcomplicate things in my mind. I try to make everything have a reason, and I love the confidence of being able to say, this is Abu Gung the Magnificent, and that's it. And you're just like, everybody, the professor is assuming that everyone knows who you're talking about, and there's no need to further explain anything.
Yeah.
And I love the lack of exposition. Not that there's none of it, but there's barely enough there so that you go, okay, but then he leaves out the stuff that he leaves out, I think, actually allows the reader to engage more with the story than something that's really overly explained.
Yeah, it also works really well with the theme, like I was talking about with like curio shops. Like it actually reminds me of Neil Gaiman a lot,
Right.
who has a similar storytelling style where he'll just kind of put you in a totally fantastical realm, and just be like, you're here.
You're
like
here now.
This is how it works. This is the physics of it. Like I'm explaining it in real time. I'm not going to get into like why or how.
Right.
And sometimes, even if they get into the why or how, they'll just be like, well, that's just how, like, yeah, there's a universe in turnips. You know that, like,
right.
It's not, it doesn't have to get into like some,
I don't know what the machine
backstory
was that he was measuring the turnip with. I don't know, I don't know how he knows that. I don't even know how he has electricity at this point to like run a machine like that.
Yeah.
And we don't need to, because the bounds of the world are set, but they're not overly explained. So like you have like Burroughs or somebody that did like Mars and Tarzan and stuff like that. They had a tendency back then to like, let me make everything make sense. They're on Mars, there's all these rays, and there's different colors of rays, and each ray has a different property, and it blah blah blah, blah, blah. And that could be interesting in types of stories, but the opposite of that Mignola does is fascinating and so well crafted that it's like, I'm not just only until you stop and think about it can you get distracted by it, because it is so assumed that everybody just gets it that you don't bother getting into the details, because you don't need to. And as soon as you tried to explain, this machine is run off of steam power, based on the coals that are, being shoveled by these homunculi in the background, you start to get distracted from the point, which is, we needed to know that there was a tiny universe in that turnip. That's it. That's the only thing we needed to know. And so the machine, it told that. It's kind of like Batman's belt always has the shark repellent that he needs at the time or whatever. And you don't see him like, with a bunch of yarn and in his cave, like plotting out all the possible permutations of the day, and then loading his belt up with it. Because it's like, we just know that Batman's utility belt has what he needs, and we know that Mignola's stories are going to, assume that you understand what's going on in a way that doesn't leave you confused.
Yeah, and another important thing tying into that comes to mind is, I think part of why it works too with Mignola is aesthetically he curates well. So like it would be hard to do that if everything didn't aesthetically feel right together.
Yeah.
And so like when he has the amazing screw-on head and then Abraham Lincoln and then like colonial style bad guys and stuff. It's like he brings all with the character designs and the costuming and the kind of weathered feel of everything. And also the mix of multiple different genres of architecture to this one kind of aesthetic. It kind of makes it feel like, yeah, well, I mean, Abraham Lincoln would totally be in that world,
Right.
you know, where it's like, it's a hard thing to do, but I think if done well, it doesn't require a lot of explanation because you have visual explanations. Like there's visual similarities, you know, where it's like, yeah.
And along those lines, the writing matches the art in another way in that he doesn't do hatching, you know, he doesn't do tiny little lines.
Mm-hmm.
He's just like, there's a shadow here. You know what the shape looks like. I don't need to tell you, right? You know what the details of a human face are. I don't need to draw every nook and cranny of it. Here's a face. There's the side of his nose. There's the under part of the eye. Let's move on. And there's almost like a simplicity of form in both the writing and the art that marry each other. I don't know if this style of writing would work for somebody like Art Adams or you know, J. Scott Campbell or somebody like that. It would feel strange to have incredibly detailed renderings of figures with very sparse exposition or explanation of what's going on.
Yeah. And then once again, I don't know if it would be as fun to look at because like half the fun of Mignola is like not only is it a monkey that just kind of randomly thrown into a story, but it's like the way he draws and stylizes monkeys is just hilarious and awesome and fun to look at. And part of it because of that kind of carved out visual simplicity, but complexity, you know, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So I can kind of see, personally seeing your work, I can see a similarity where you're pulling, you know, some mythology with ships, with like, you know, ancient sea creature monsters, and kind of pulling all these different threads together that don't necessarily need like a logic to them.
Yeah.
But aesthetically feel right. And you kind of don't have to over explain. And I think that's actually pretty cool. And I can definitely see that influencing your work. So
yeah,
but I would say like there probably isn't an artist in comics today who's not at least slightly influenced by Mignola, because at least visually, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if you could look. This would be an interesting thesis if anybody's in a graduate program. Take a look at the use of spotting blacks in the history of comics and see how much. You know, the three figures that we've talked about have probably influenced it, because I bet you see a marked increase, you know, as Will Eisner and Frank Miller and Mike Mignola kind of came onto the scene. I mean, when Mignola was doing the X-Men, it was kind of weird, you know, not bad or good, but it was just kind of like not the Marvel House style. And then he moved over into indie, and just all of a sudden he was like, now I can do whatever I want. And it just was incredible. And he got less complex and more masterful in the execution of his forms as he kind of moved into indie comics. And it's kind of the same thing like we talked recently about Scotty Young. Mm-hmm. Scotty Young had a very similar track as he moved away from doing mainstream comics into doing the Wizard of Oz, which was still Marvel, but kind of an odd way to do Marvel. I mean, he really blossomed when he was able to come into his own and create characters instead of like, oh, this is so-and-so's version of Cyclops, and this is so-and-so's version of Wolverine, and it's like, no, this is Professor Snap, and this is Abu Gung, and this is the Amazing Screw on Head, and I made them up, and so you can't compare them to anybody else. This is what they look like. I love that in indie comics as well, that you just can invent characters.
Yeah, the other thing I love about kind of indie comics that aren't just working for like the main guys is there's a recognizability of artists who, you know, like Jim Lee is a good example of an artist who's very married to properties. Like, it's like, I don't remember Jim Lee for anything he did with Image, weirdly enough. Like, I remember him as a founder of Image,
right?
But it's like, when I think Jim Lee, I think like X-Men and Batman. It's like
Right.
and he did such a great job on it that it's kind of easy to recognize his work. And there's a million examples like that in mainstream comics, but there's a thing about like Mignola where it's like it's so much more recognizable. Same with like Sam Keith, like artists who kind of go outside of the box with their style and are so identifiable. I think it's just, I understand there's like more subtlety with like the kind of house style guys, but I love when an artist kind of goes outside of that and kind of redefines style. And that's one of the things I love about indies. It's like next week we're, going to be going into like Fun Home and, eventually Black Hole. And it's like each artist that we're going to be covering, I love the fact that like most of them, you wouldn't blink and question who did it. Like you'd be like, oh, that's so-and-so, like instantly. And I love that voice of indies. And I think that might have something to do with what we are going to be defining indie. Cause I know it's going to be a little weird. It's like, is Random House indie?
Right.
Is Dark Horse even indie at this point? But it's like, I do think that has something to do with the vibe of like the kind of things we're going to be reviewing,
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of which, people should go to the irsagency.com to see what our upcoming episodes are. And if you'd like to participate with us, buy these books, or if you have these books, reread them again. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you send us a review and we like it, we will, and we have time for it, we'll put it on the show with us. We've had Gary Hodges do that, who is going to be a special guest coming up soon. And he's going to do Tardies in a couple weeks. And you will see that we've got kind of those books available. Clicking on those will bring you to affiliate links. So that helps us out, helps us keep the lights on. And we also have past episodes as well. So if you want to go see the stuff that we've covered in the past, if you haven't subscribed, subscribe. If your friends haven't subscribed, tell them to do that, and all that jazz. Also, if you would like to join us on Twitch, we're also on Twitch and YouTube, and we are about to close this live stream and do a post party, an after party. Those are only available behind a paywall on Patreon. So if you'd like some extra content, I have a feeling that this time we are going to talk about the Invincible cartoon. So if you're interested in that and you want to hear our thoughts on one of the best cartoons adaptations of comic books that I think has ever happened, then jump onto Patreon. Josh, where can we find your stuff?
You can find me at joshuakemble.com. And then as usual, you can find my book, 2 stories, my autobiographical graphic novel that's 122 pages. This is book 1. And you can find this on Amazon. It's a good book. It talks about some pretty serious topics, but I think it's right up the alley of people who are fans of this show and fans of the work that we're reviewing and stuff. So yeah, go buy that at Amazon or any online retailer. And Cory, where can everybody find your stuff and watch your awesome sneak peeks at your Wacom animations?
Yeah, you can find my stuff at CoryKerr.com. And if you go to CoryKerr.com/online, that'll bring you to a page that has social media accounts and different animations that I've done and different comics that you can read for free and different things like that. One of those links is going to take you to Instagram, where I am currently sharing some stories that are only going to be up for a limited amount of time of kind of some behind the scenes stuff that's going on. So if you're interested in taking a look at some rotoscoping and how I'm going to figure out a fairly complex, I think it's probably one of the most complex things that I've animated before. And I'm trying to figure out how to simplify it. So Mignola is kind of a key here. Then you can check those out on the stories. And other than that, check us out on irsagency.com. That'll take you to the page, and we'll catch you guys later. If you haven't watched some of the past episodes, go do that, and we'll see.
Subscribe. Subscribe, hit the bell.
Link, bell, all that jazz, thumbs up, leave a comment, obey the algorithm gods. They must be appeased.